putting together this series. I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 5 or 6 minutes, or sort of frame our conversation, to frame our thinking about this moment, and then we can dive into. I believe you all have some questions, and then I guess we can dive into some questions from the audience. Excuse me, from the audience as well. Good to see a bunch of familiar faces and names. A number of my colleagues and students. Hey, Shri, on the call. All right, so yeah, so I think about civil rights, and I write about civil rights, and I teach about the civil rights movement. And one of the things that I tend to want to do in my classes is take us back to the beginning, right? Take us back to the beginning of our nation's history. And the reason I think it's important for us to start there is because one of the misconceptions that we tend to have in modern times, right, is that, you know, if we simply speak to an issue, if we simply address a problem in calm, cool, and collected ways, then we can come together and fix that problem, right? So you see a lot of this sentiment now with protests in the wake of some violence popping off in a number of cities, right? This overarching question about, well, why, you know, why aren't people doing it the right way, right? Why aren't people engaging in these conversations the way that Dr. King did, you know, and things of this nature, right? So that's the type of thinking that is emblematic of a disconnection a disconnection from a longer narrative, right? A longer narrative of racial subordination, a longer narrative of white supremacy, right? So so I think it's really important for us to start at the very beginning. So the very beginning, the 1600s in this country, Africans are starting to pour in from Africa as enslaved people. First record of them coming in North America, at least 1619, right? So from 1619 to 1660, slavery is being codified. This is a century before the Revolutionary War, right? So a century before the Revolutionary War, the colonies had established a racial hierarchy in this country, right? Built soundly upon the principle of white supremacy. White folks were at the top, and then after that, it was a race for place, right? So in that period from 1619 to the 1770s, right, there's two going on this land. One of those things is the beginning of what would come to be almost 300 years of warfare against indigenous people, right? We sit on land that is not ours, right? We go to school on land that is not ours. So that's the first fact that we have to understand, right? We are on land that was taken from indigenous people. All in the context of the nation, these colonies working their way towards an iteration of what would come to be known as democracy in North America. The other thing to keep in mind, again, is the importation of Africans who were being kidnapped from the continent of Africa and being forced to work for the rest of their natural lives, right? And so the Africans that come into this place are subordinated. All of the institutions we have in our society that are supposed to affirm life do the exact opposite for Black folk, right? So when we look to the church, particularly in the American South, is in the process from the late 1600s to the early 1700s of moving the issue of slavery and racial subordination from a moral question, economic question. Therefore, we can't talk about that. We're not going to really discuss that, right? The economic infrastructure of the country is based upon the subjugation, the enslavement of Black people. Our political infrastructure also sanctifies and acknowledges slavery. Slavery is woven into the fabric of the Constitution, right? So start here. Why do these things matter? Well, these things matter because this is what we're still literally fighting against, right? We are fighting against the legacy of African enslavement. We are fighting against the legacy a white supremacist legacy of racial segregation that is woven into the fabric of American life, right? So we understand that slavery takes us up into the 1860s, 1865. And then from 1865 to 1965, we go through a brief period of Reconstruction, then we go through a period of segregation, right? Another version of racial subordination where African Americans are separated out of the mainstream of American life, right? And that comes to us in the form of the images that we see from the 1930s, 1940s of black children, for instance, going to separate schools than white children, right? So then the other thing we have to remember in this moment is the ways in which segregation, the ways in which racial subordination impact every single element, every single aspect of life for Black people in this country, right? When you are enslaved, when you are owned by somebody else, you can't own property. When you are owned by somebody else, you don't have a bank account. When you are owned by somebody else, you don't have the autonomy to go wherever you would like to go. You are completely and constantly under suspicion. Does that sound familiar? When you show up places where you're not supposed to be, right? The historian Roger Wilkins says of the Revolutionary period, we were in the process, when it came to Black folks, we were in the process of creating an upside down Bill of Rights, right? The freedom of assembly that white folks could enjoy, Black folks could not enjoy that. The Second Amendment, of course, was unspeakable. Of course, Black folks will not have a right to keep and bear arms, right? Of course, Black people will not have access to the amendment related to illegal search and seizure. We can seize you whenever we want. We can search you whenever we want, because in the words of the of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Roger Taney, the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the Negro has no rights is bound to respect. This is seminal. This is crucial, right? Again, the Supreme Court of the United States said the Negro has no rights a white man is bound to respect. So what does that mean? It means, again, that this subordination is affirmed by the highest levels of government. The other thing that's really important about this case is that Taney did not say slaves don't have rights that white men are bound to respect. He said Negroes, all Blacks, right? Enslaved as well as free. So we need to think about that. We need to think through that and think about that issue. So how do you fight? How do you fight the sky, right? If white supremacy is the water and we are the fish, how do you fight that? How do you try to lay claim to your rights? How do you try to lay claim to your humanity, let alone your civil rights and your political rights? What does that fight look like? What do you do? How do you fight? And the answer to that question is you fight any way you can. That's the answer to that question, right? So how do Blacks confront slavery? They run away. They defend themselves vigorously. Sometimes they rise up and kill their masters. When they're free, when Black folks are free, right, they work with their white allies to create anti-slavery legislation, right? So there we see all of the different sorts of avenues that Black folk and their allies are going to construct when it comes to how do we get free, right? And so there's all conversations and debates in the 19th century about what does freedom mean? What does it look like? Does it mean becoming citizens? Does it mean having the right to vote? Does it mean having the right to own land? Should we stay here or should we leave the country altogether? Again, this is another raging debate within African American communities. Should we even stay in the United States? Should we go back? Should we go, quote unquote, back to Africa? Should we go to Central America? Should we go to Latin America? Should we hook up with other Black communities in other parts of the world and figure it out from there? So these are all raging debates within African American communities. And so as we move through time, we see Black folks seeking to gain what my friend and the brilliant historian Hassan Jeffries calls freedom rights. What does that look like? It looks like I want bodily autonomy. I want to be able to own land. I want to be able to defend myself from people who to do me harm. I want to be able to rise and fall based on my own abilities in the nation, right? Freedom rights. These are rights that are being articulated by freed African Americans, by free Black people in the 1860s. And that sounds like, and these things should sound familiar to us now, right? And so when we move into the 20th century, we're moving into a time where, again, Black folks are employed in a whole range of activities designed to get themselves free. There are some people who are saying, look, you know what, we need to lay claim to our rights. We need to try to gain access to the right to vote so that we can affect the levers of political power, right? So there's people trying to do that. Those people are meeting massive opposition, particularly in the American South, where we still live at this point. Massive opposition to Black folks trying to vote. So Black folks move. Millions of African Americans during the Great Migration, the early 20th century, leave the American South and again plant their flags in Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Los Angeles, all these places outside of the American South, right? To generate another front in this war, in this struggle for freedom. So you've got people pursuing electoral rights. You've got people who are fighting against lynching. You've got folks who are saying, look, let's go back to Africa. You've got all manner of philosophical and political and religious orientations. You've got people who are saying, the practice of my religion leads me to be nonviolent. You've got other people that say the practice of my religion leads me to defend myself with every inch of my being, right? So when we get into the 1950s, we get into the 1960s, all of these traditional modes of protest, again, trying to, accessing the right to vote, protesting, folks creating voter leagues, folks creating, engaging in boycotts, like in Montgomery and places like this. We start to see the creation of a moment, of a time, right, in the 1950s and 1960s, where increasingly Black folks are going to be engaged in the process of creating a new language. And that new language is the language of protest, because all of these other traditional methods had not gotten us far enough. Again, by the 1960s, Black folks have been free for 100 years, right? A century, right? And so by the time we get into the 1960s, a whole bunch of folks are saying, you know what, enough is enough. Let's streets, let's engage in boycotts, let's engage in protests, let's really stick it to our elected officials and our local leadership, Black and white, right? So that we can create, again, a new language and create a new context in which we can pursue our rights, right? And so that's what's happening in the 1960s. And again, this is a cacophony. There's a whole bunch of ideologies knocking up against each other, right? One of the myths that we have to dispel in that moment is this myth of unity, right? This idea that Martin Luther King led all of the Negroes, right? And then Barack Obama was elected president and Michael Jordan was a basketball player, right? That's not what happened, right? The 1960s is a product of dissent, is a product of disagreement, it's a product of people coming together and pulling apart, right? Ideologically, politically, tactically, right? So it's that progress, it's that cacophony that creates the forward motion of a civil rights movement. So you see people pursuing legislation, which is absolutely what should happen. You see other people saying, you know what, thinking about freedom and autonomy. You see raging debates about the role of some people saying, look, we need to be physically integrated into the mainstream of American life. Other people saying, I don't know about that. I don't know if that's the path for freedom for Black people. Raging debate within African American communities, right? Should we retain our own institutions? Should we retain our own banks and churches and organizations, right? Should we retain our own, the infrastructure that we built over the course of a century? Some people say yes. Some people say, I don't know, maybe not so much, right? So again, all of these raging debates and dialogues that are taking place in the 1960s, we see echoes of those raging debates and dialogues now. And the other thing that we see an echo of in the contemporary period is the ways in which progress is achieved, right? The NAACP has done an amazing job of pursuing court cases and helping us to pursue particular types of legislation. right? So that's one, again, that's one element of this movement. The protest wing of the movement has also helped to achieve very notable, very notable accomplishments. And these factions are often working in tandem with each other. But one of the things that we've noticed, right, one of the things that we know to be true is that these moments of mass-based protest, these moments of mass-based movement, right, are moments of vast possibility, right, political, cultural, and economic possibility, because once again, a collective voice is speaking loudly enough so that everybody else in the room can understand we mean business, right? So as I've said on my Facebook page and a couple of other places, all of the forward motion that we see taking place right now has not been brought to you courtesy of the Chamber of Commerce. It is not brought to you courtesy of the local Ministers Association. It's not brought to you courtesy of Bank of America. It's brought to you courtesy of millions of people in the streets willing and able to shut down their cities, right? So that people can hear what we are trying to say with regard to police brutality. So, so that's a lot. Again, I just want to sort of set the table so we can have a conversation about this moment and how this moment sort of matches up or doesn't match up to previous moments. So I'm happy to answer any of the questions you all have come up with.
Hi. Sorry.
No problem.
Can I ask a question? Okay.
Sure.
Hi. My name is Amy. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to educate us on this topic. I have a question that was sort of inspired by an interview I was watching between Hassan Minhaj and Keith Ellison, who is the Attorney General handling the Derek Chauvin case in Minneapolis. And you touched on this a lot in your talk about the debate with the efficacy of protesting and the cacophony of the movement to create change. But we've seen like the Ferguson protests back in 2014, and result of that, we see like millions of dollars get spent on police reform, like the implementation of police cameras and implicit bias trainings. But despite all of that, we still see the prevalence of police brutality. Do you see the protests that we're seeing today being different? Does it have to be a step-by-step process? Because we're still not seeing change, if that makes sense. But
right.
We're still seeing a lot of protests. So
right.
Do you see that the protests we're seeing today being the final catalyst for change in the coming years?
I don't see it as a final catalyst. I see this as an evolutionary process, right? We are all in the pursuit of greater freedom. And I don't think you ever get completely and totally free, right? I think that's a process. And then I think that's an endeavor that we all engage to undertake, or many of us engage to undertake. Those of us who think that we are not quite free yet, we will undertake that endeavor to get more free, right? So one of the things I think is different in this particular moment, right, is that we have stripped away any sort of controversy with regard to what happened to these three individuals, right? Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. So there's no debates here about, oh, did they have a gun? Were they a threat or a danger to the police officers or to these private citizens? So what we're talking about here are three instances of murder, right? And so what's being laid bare in this moment is people seeing and understanding how the murder of Black people just doesn't matter, right? For the Ahmaud Arbery case, the thing that I like to point out to people that we have to continue talking about, right, is that in addition to being murdered by these three racial terrorists, it took three district attorneys to finally get to a district attorney that said, you know what, maybe we should arrest these guys. Three. The first district attorney saw the tape that we all saw and said, there's no crime there. The second district attorney saw the tape and said, there's no crime there. And then when the howl of protest started to be generated, then the third district attorney said, okay, well, maybe I do see a crime, but he also saw, right, the way in which this was spreading like wildfire, right, on social media, right? So, so the thing that might be different this time around, right? Well, one thing that's definitely different, right, is we haven't seen the volume of protest, this volume of protest in a generation, right? You know, in the wake of, you know, Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile. I mean, you know, there's a long tragic litany of Black people who have been murdered by the cops, right, by private citizens. But we've not seen protests on this scale, on this volume, in a really long time, right? We've had protests in all 50 states. We've had protests, Black Lives Matter protests in rural Oklahoma and rural Idaho, places where they only have anti-abortion marches, right? Because people have seen, have seen and have been confronted, I think, with the depth of the problem, right? George Floyd is murdered by this cop, and the official police report says that George Floyd died of a medical incident, right? That's the official language on the initial police report, right? So, you know, and Breonna Taylor on that police report, you know, injuries, none, right? She got shot 8 times after the no-knock warrant was being executed, right? But on the official document, it says no injuries, right? So again, so there's 2 things here. One is people are having to confront the reality of the fact that for a critical mass of people in this country, we're still beholden to the dynamics that were being created back in 1619 with regard to Black life. It doesn't matter, right? And this is what it looks like when particular lives don't matter, right? You can have a cop basically exterminate, you know, execute somebody, and knowing full well that this has been videoed, still, right, feel empowered enough to write on the official documents that the thing that we all saw did not actually happen, right? This is par for the course in many instances, again, because these lives don't matter. And so one of the things that I think is that hopefully is different this time is that people are really coming to grips with the depth of the problem. Now, does that mean that, you know, but that understanding does not necessarily mean that we're gonna not have arguments and debates about what should happen, right? There are some people who are saying we need to keep, you know, we need to double down on reform. Other people are saying we need to defund, other to abolish, right? This is a system of policing is a system that has its roots in a slave system. And so this is rotted to the core, a whole bunch of abolitionists would suggest. So we need to blow it up and try again, right? So what am I hopeful for in this moment? I'm hopeful that we will have a sustained and real critical conversation about the depth of the problem, right? And while we're also having that conversation, I hope people will go out and register to vote so that they can vote out the clowns who don't think that there is a problem, right? So if your local district attorney is like, well, you know, if a few Black people or a few brown people or a few queer people or a few trans people or a few homeless people have to die so that the white part of town feels safe, well, then it's time for them to lose their jobs, right? So that's what I hope for in this moment.
Thank you for that response. We have some questions in the chat box, so I'm just going to read them out. How do you see the role of the protest organizers that choose to meet with the establishment?
The role of protest organizers. So this is a cat and mouse. So this is always a cat and mouse game, right? In terms of the types of moves elected officials are trying to make, as well as the types of moves that protest leaders are trying to make. So what it means that when you have mass-based protests, right, you very rarely have 1 or even 2 people that can be explicitly identified in those moments, in those movements, right? There's generally a coterie of people, right? There's generally a small crew of people that can be identified and recognized, right? So elected officials have some choices to make when it comes to how they want to interact and respond to the protesters, right? So one version of the way this plays out is is elected officials make the best make worthwhile efforts to meet with the people who are connected to organizations and connected to groups, right, that have been doing the work on the ground for a while, right? Because sometimes there's a difference between people who've been engaged in long-term struggle and people who sort of emerge in these moments of crisis / unity, right? And so our mayor here in Memphis is doing, right, is, it seems like every day he's meeting with somebody, right? So, so I don't know what that means, right? I don't see that. So as far as I can tell, his strategy is, I'm gonna meet with a whole host of people, right? And, and as far as I can tell, that's the way in which you dilute, right, the obligation you feel towards the city, right? So it's the difference between saying, okay, here are the 5 people that I know who have been, in the trenches and who've been doing this work for a long time, and I'm going to meet with them to figure out how we're going to move forward, versus I'm going to meet with 88 people, right? Some of them who are tied to organizations, many of whom who are not, and from that particular cacophony, I will craft something. Right. And that something is almost always going to be watered down, because the voices of 88, right, and the voices of 5, right, are very, aren't consonant, right? Those two things are very inconsistent. And also, when elected officials like Mayor Strickland refuse to meet with organization heads who've been doing this work for a long time, that's also another way to avoid the voices of the people who have been very clearly articulating what their wants, needs, and desires are, right? So let me just put it on the table. When the mayor doesn't want to meet with the architects of the People's Convention, right, that means that he is ignoring the articulation of a significant subset of the community, right? Running around talking about what do people want. The people have been telling you what they want, right? 4 years ago, when Black folks shut down the I-40 bridge, they told you what they wanted, and you ignored them largely, right? So here we are again with another set of protests, and and so this is an opportunity for the do-over. Quite frankly, I haven't been too impressed with the mayor's performance. It reminds me of the last time he had this opportunity and kind of flubbed it, right? Because I don't see a willingness by the mayor or his administration. I don't see a willingness to meet with the people who are generating, and to meet with folks who are true conduits of community input. So so there's a number of ways that this can play out. And again, we're in the middle of this, right? So we'll see what happens, because all kinds of folks have options in terms of what they're going to do or not do. And so when you meet with the mayor and you don't have a base of power, right? You're affiliated with any particular organization or anything like that, then you come out and say, oh, mayor and I agreed that we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Whole people are going to be like, well, who are you? Right? X, Y, and Z. We didn't ask you for that, right? So so that's the other thing that could happen. But we're in the middle of it still, so we'll see. The questions from the chat.
Yes. So, how do we maintain the momentum?
How do we maintain the momentum? That's the question, right? That is always one of the questions. How do we maintain the momentum? One of the biggest roadblocks in these and other moments is this idea that this is work that only happens around 2 instances, right? This is work that only happens around the buildup of movements, which usually happen in the wake of, you know, the murder of a Black person, something horrific happening to some person of color, right? Or elections or election season. So that's a problem, right? Because one of the most consistent sort of long-term solutions that we have to being able to successfully engage in what King calls the beautiful struggle to build a new world. One of the most viable tools we have at our disposal is the creation and cultivation of a mass-based movement, right? The creation and cultivation of a mass-based movement. When we get a critical mass of people, for instance, here in Memphis, who have signed on to a political platform, right? A platform not necessarily of a political party. You'll notice I did not say, right, the Democrats' platform or the Republicans' platform. That's the other thing about the civil rights movement, right? People tend to associate that movement with one political party or the other, and that's problematic, right? So when we come together, right, when poor and working class people create the space for themselves to create a political agenda and then are able to advance that political agenda, right? That's a function of base building, of mass-based community organizing, right? So that in addition to saying, right, in addition to being able to electoral politics, people can also be engaged in all of the work that take place in between elections, right, where actually the real work happens. So that's one of the things that we're struggling with in Memphis, and people are struggling with this all over the country, right? Is how do you build a mass-based movement, right? How do you engage in the education? How do you bring people? How do you build sanctuary and community where people can feel like their voices have been heard? How do you create an instance or an environment where people feel like they matter, right? And if they feel like they matter, then they will engage and participate, and they'll expand the type of participation that they have, right? To go from, right, you know, in many instances, just sort of a level of discontent, passivity, right? I don't trust any of these fools, which is also a very valid political point in many instances. You know, I don't trust any of these fools. I'm not going to do anything about it. Moving that individual from I don't trust people, I don't trust these politicians, I'm not doing anything about it, to, hey, you know what? If we engage in this process, we can start to make some more clear choices and decisions about the types of people we want representing us, both in elected offices, but also in our communities, right? And we can start to have more sustained conversations about how we want our community to unfold moving forward, right? So that's one of the ways you gain momentum, is you create spaces of opportunity for people to come in and engage. Because again, disaffected people are the folks that don't feel a sense of connection, right? People who are deeply engaged in the community, right? So we have models for that. It's the people who, people who are engaged in their society are people who feel like they can change their society, right? It's no coincidence that, that middle class and middle class folk and other elites vote at higher levels because they feel like they have a stake in the outcome, right? They have higher levels of engagement in particular sorts of institutions and particular sorts of structures. And folks, and poor and working class folk, they also have high levels of participation in all manner of institutions and structures. But there's a political orientation for a whole lot of working class folk. You know what? My voice does not matter, right? And so why should I engage the world in these more ways, right? So, so there's lots of opportunity here. Oh, I see a question about how we've maintained momentum. Hey, Andrea Durham. Bus boycott lasted 300 plus days. Yes, well, again, the Montgomery bus boycott, that's a great example. One of the things that we miss in that story is the titanic level of organization that takes place in Montgomery to make that bus boycott last 380 days. If you have 15,000, if you have tens of thousands of people not getting on the bus, how are they getting to work every day? Right? They're getting to work every day by basically the cab company, right? That activists have to create, that's providing 10 to 15,000 rides a day, right? For Black folk who are not getting on those buses. That is a massive organizing, that's a massive feat of organizing, right? It is funded, it is insured, right? The Montgomery Improvement Association gets their insurance from Lloyd's of London when they can't find an insurance company in the United States that will insure their cars, right? So that's a massive level of organizing that has to take place. This is one of the challenges that we see here in Memphis. There's a dearth of organizers, right? There's a dearth of people engaged in and doing this work on a consistent and persistent basis. There are so many folks I know who are immersed. Shout out to my squad, Shahida Jones of Black Lives Matter, and Tammy Sawyer, Commissioner Sawyer, Dr. Earl Fisher, Andre Johnson, Kedron Franklin, right? I mean, so there's folks out here who are laboring in these vineyards, right? But of those individuals I just named, we need 100 more of them. We need 200 more of them. We need 400 more of them. And that's not to say that they're the only ones here, right? But that's one of the challenges, right? Is creating a cadre of organizers who can do this work, right? And who can also exhibit the revolutionary patience in order to get this work done. Andrea's second question, can you touch upon protest and creating change in corporate America? Oh, that's a good one. So, corporate America moves in the direction of the society, right? So, for instance, when Starbucks said, "Oh, none of our employees can wear Black Lives Matter paraphernalia," the blowback was massive, and then all of a sudden, right, Starbucks employees got black all over their clothing, right? So we live in an age and a time where the public has much more opportunity to push corporations in progressive and productive ways. The other thing that has to happen, though, is that that Black folk and other non-white folk and their white allies in corporate America are going to have to start. They're going to have to kick it up a notch, quite frankly, right? If you're the only Black person on in your organization, at some point in time, you're gonna have to have a conversation with somebody about that, right? At some point in time, you're gonna have to be like, "Yo, hey, this is a problem." Right? And that's the other thing that can happen in these moments when we have these moments of possibility, such as the moment that we're in now. Corporations are their ears are open, right? So we're seeing a whole bunch of checks get written these days, which is good. It's still a drop in the bucket, but it's a step in the right direction. So people who work in corporate America that want to see a better America, they have to step it up, and they have to figure out how they can engage in this beautiful struggle from their purchase in corporate America, right? And so sometimes that's work that you're doing explicitly. Sometimes that's work you're kind of doing under the radar, but you've got to figure out where you plug in and make it happen, right? And just like with everybody else, sometimes you're gonna have to put a little fat on the line, right? When it comes to how these advances are made, right? We, a whole bunch of folks risked everything to get us where we are, right? A whole bunch of folks risked everything to get us where we are. So, so if we're not willing to risk, the yearly bonus, when it comes to, creating change within our places of employment, then it's probably not going to happen. So I see a question here from Rhonda Neal. Hey, Rhonda, do you have a personal opinion of whether Blacks should create their own community, church, bank, etc.? And what would some pros and cons, and what would be some pros and cons of separation? That's a good question. Um, that's a real good question. I think that that's a real fluid thing, right? And my mind goes initially to churches, right, to religious institutions, and and this idea that Sunday is the most segregated day in America, and that's probably true, and there's a reason for that, right? In the days after slavery, enslaved people who had been forced to go to the church of the people who owned them suddenly had the option: do I continue to go to my master's church, or do I build my own church? Do I go to a church with people who, or do I not go to church with my former master? And spoiler alert, millions of African Americans chose not to go to church with the people who used to own them, right? So, so that's not a nefarious choice on the part of Black people in the 1870s and 1880s, right? That's not a problematic choice in my mind to say I'm not going to go to church with the people who used to own me, right? The the growth and development of the Black church isn't necessary. I mean, it just is. It is a place of sanctuary. It is a place where Black folk could come and feel fully human. They could come and express the full expression of their humanity. So in that regard, that Black space, that Black space was essential, right, for the health and well-being of Black people. Same thing for Black colleges and universities, right? Black institutions are made within the confines of segregation, but the reasons for those institutions don't necessarily die off because segregation has been ruled unconstitutional, right? Like I'm telling my students all the time, Howard University, or my beloved alma mater, Morehouse College, right? They're created in the 1860s, and they're created in the context of segregation. So so when people say, well, should Morehouse close? I'll be like, why? Morehouse didn't have any rules in their in the handbook that said white people are not allowed to come. That's not in the handbook. That's not in the handbook at Howard or Lemoyne Owen or my sister's alma mater, Hampton, right? That's a choice, right? There's no white people at Morehouse College because white people don't want to go they don't want to go to school in places and spaces where they're in the minority. That's why Morehouse is still all Black. Howard is still, the vast majority of students at Howard University are Black, right? So, and so when you think about the role and the vibrancy of Black institutions, I think Black institutions still very much have a role to play. Black banks, most definitely, right? Because those are the financial institutions that are most attuned to the financial needs of Black communities, right? So yes, so the short answer, well, it's not short. So one of the answers to this question is most definitely, because again, these spaces play a vital role in the sanctuary and the facilitation of prosperity, of educational equity and parity. Black colleges, there's less than 200 Black colleges in the country, but those Black colleges are educating a third of all Black undergraduates, right? So so there's something there, right? So definitely there's still very much a need for Black institutions.
Should we advocate for police abolition or reform of oppressive policies? Is advocating for reform counterintuitive?
Wow, that's a great question. So this is the debate that we're having, right? One of the things that I think about in this moment was that one of the most progressive, reform-minded police departments in a major city in the country is the Minneapolis Police Department, right? They are a model of a police department that has undergone all manner of reforms, right? So the problem, as I see it, right, the problem isn't so much reform or tactics. The problem is, we live in a culture, all of us live in a culture, and and the cops also live in a culture, and they work for an organization that doubles down on the inclination to disregard Black life, right? So the cop who shot the brother in the back in front of Wendy's in Atlanta, right? 9 months earlier, he had gone to a de-escalation training. So what happened? The training went out the window because he was dealing with a Black person, right? Training goes out the window. The cop who shot Tamir Rice, who murdered a 12-year-old playing with a toy gun in a park, right? Shot him 1.79 seconds after he got there. His training went out the window, right? So no opportunity to assess the situation, no opportunity to think through any other sorts of different possibilities and stuff like that, right? But what we know, or at least I think I know, right? If it had been 12-year-old white girl Tammy Rice playing in the park with a toy gun, Tammy Rice probably would not have been shot to death, right? So that's not, so how does reform fix that, right? How do you reform your way out of that, right? And I don't know that you can reform your way out of that. Particularly if you're not going to understand and recognize and come to grips with, right, the depth of our investment in white supremacy, again, which takes us back to 1619, right? So it's going to be really interesting to see how we move forward from here. The cacophony between abolition and defunding and reform, it's going to be really interesting.
Do you think we have time to take a few more questions?
Sure. I see Zaria's question. What are your thoughts on the community-based nonprofits in Memphis and the role that they could be playing in this moment, above and beyond the letter that many executive leaders signed? All right. So, hey, Zaria, Sister Jones, good question. Full disclosure, my wife, my better half, Natalie McKinney, is one of the architects of that letter. So in terms of that letter from the nonprofits, I think that letter is brilliant, is wonderful, and is awesome. And I'm not just saying that because my wife helped to write it, although I am saying that because my wife helped to write it. So I think that the community-based nonprofits in Memphis, they got a lot of work to do. In Memphis, we still suffer from what one scholar calls the plantation mentality. Right, and that plantation mentality works a little bit like this: we're going to create the conditions that coerce poverty. Right, we are going to make sure that we don't pay anybody, that we don't pay a critical mass of people living wages. We're going to create a business model that is predicated on, that is built on Black poverty. Right? And we're not going to touch that reality. We're going to leave that alone. Now we're going to come over here with our nonprofits and try to confront poverty, right? So in a lot of ways, the nonprofit sector in Memphis, it's like they have stage 3 terminal cancer, but they think they're ready to go run an Ironman competition. Right? The nonprofit community in Memphis is in a bad way, and a critical mass of them don't know that they're in a bad way. And the reason they don't know they're in a bad way is because, like so many other sectors in the community, they are determined to ignore the voices of Black people. They're determined to ignore the voices of non-white people, right? We live in a majority Black town, and the nonprofit sector looks like, you look at the demographics of the nonprofit sector, you would not know that that was a nonprofit demographic from Memphis, right? Nonprofits are just really, really good at ignoring the voices and the input of people, Black people and brown people, ignoring the input from the people who live in the community they serve, and then turn around and ask, well, how come our programming isn't working? Well, your programming is not working because you're not listening to any of the people that you want the programming to, right? So this is a classic problem that nonprofits all over the country have. Every 5 years, the nonprofit sector releases this report that talks about how organizations led by people of color receive less money than organizations led by white folks, Black people in particular, right? So every 5 years, this report comes out. Every 5 years, this report comes out that says, look, nonprofits, you need to start taking Black people seriously. Look, nonprofits, you need to start hiring more Black people. Nonprofits and foundations, you need to start hiring more Black people. You need to start listening to Black people. And every 5 years, people sort of nod and smile, and then they shove that report. If they even opened it, they close the report and keep doing the same thing that they do in terms of ignoring Black people, right? So the nonprofit sector here has got a whole bunch of work to do, and hopefully this is a moment where they understand the nature of that, and they can step up their game a little bit because they got a lot of work to do.
I think this would be a good question to end on. What practices have sustained you as an individual and activist, and what practices can we do as students to start today to keep ourselves from burning out?
So one of the things that I think it's important for students and activists to engage in is rest. You got to take care of yourselves, right? And this is something that I grapple with and I battle with all the time, right? If I'm not working 12 and 13, particularly now living in the age of the coronavirus, right? Now I can sit here in my office, which is actually my kitchen, right? I can sit here, now I can sit here, 13 hours straight, 14 hours straight. And so on those days when I don't sit here 14 hours straight, I'm thinking, man, I'm slacking off. I should be more engaged. I need to get back to it. And so no, right? One of the most important things that we can do is to take care of ourselves. The other thing that we can do is create pockets of sanctuary for one another, right? So so you and all of your friends, you and your co-conspirators, you all need to figure out how you can hang out, right? Whether it's via Zoom or at a great big field somewhere, right? If you're in the same town, figure out how you can be in community with people. I recently started, some friends of mine and I recently started a book club. These are some of my oldest friends on the planet. We've known each other for over 30 years. And we get together every 2 weeks after having read a piece of classic literature. And it has been wildly therapeutic to sit around and chop it up with a bunch of the homies about, this Russian novel or this American short story or whatever it is that we're reading. That's been really really generative. So step away from the battle. Remember that even soldiers got to take breaks, right? Nobody stayed on the front lines 365 days in most instances, I should say, right? So figure out a way to take care of yourself. Figure out a way to be in community with your friends. Don't be afraid to whisper to one another about the dreams you have for a new world. Dream, and in the words of Langston Hughes, laugh, eat well, and grow strong.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney, for sharing with us today. We're almost at time, so I'm going to stop us. We still have some questions that we didn't get to, but hopefully with our future webinars that we can try to answer some of those as well. We have 6 more webinars coming. Here is a schedule if you are interested in any of these, please come back and join us again for the very important conversation. Oops. Thank you guys so much for coming today. And I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you all for
Thank you,
having me. Really
Dr.
appreciate it. Good session.